Live.
Hello, everybody. It is 4 o'clock Central Daylight Time. And in Kansas City, Missouri, or Kansas City area, where all three of us are, but we are joining virtually with all of you. If you join us, please post a link, post a comment so we know who's here. We do know most of our viewers will look at this later. But we are excited to be here to talk about this great book. Welcome, Brett and Dave. You guys want to introduce yourself? Brett, go first.
Sure. My name's Bret Getzel. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Purchasing at Premier Custom Foods. I got an extensive background and experience in the food production industry and extremely passionate about leadership and culture and some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So thank you so much for this platform and this opportunity to connect. And obviously it's kept me grounded and kept me reading, which is so important to my own personal development.
Yeah, thanks. Dave?
All right, Kelly, Bret, thanks for letting me join you today. Dave Lingerfelt, professor of healthcare and data analytics at Rockhurst University. So spent my 20 plus years working in some fashion connected to healthcare in some way, shape, or form. And the last decade, focused a lot of my work around the data and analytics around what makes healthcare do what it does. Spend my time teaching those things. Data visualization, healthcare IT, and just general technology at Rockhurst University. So real happy to be here.
And we all know each other from Rockhurst University. And I'm Kelly Byrnes, an adjunct professor there in the MBA program and executive coach in the executive MBA program. So Dave and I are colleagues, and Brett was in one of my classes when he got his MBA a couple of years ago. And I also lead Voyage Consulting Group. My career has been spent half in industry and half in consulting. So I've spent time in operations, marketing, strategic planning, and human resources. And my last corporate job was, before I started Voyage, was as chief talent officer for a government defense contractor and a research company. So I have a variety of background, sort of like most of the authors that we choose for our conversations. So we try to bring in authors that are from industry and not only consultants or not only in academia. And this one will go into the background in just a minute, but I wanted to take a minute to remind everybody, or some of you that are new, of the purpose of our conversations. Brett and I started these last year. So this is our fifth one. And Dave's second and Brett and my fifth. And we started them to encourage people to continue with their leadership development. And Brett, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. I had the opportunity to be a guest speaker in one of Kelly's classes and just started talking, a classic guest speaker, tell us about your journey. And as we hit on different themes, the theme that really resonated, two of them was one, what was I reading, which I would have never expected that to really hit a positive nerve. And then second was mentoring. And we spent the bulk of our hour together discussing what was on my reading list and how to become a good mentee rather than a mentor. And out of that, this conversation with leaders topic blossomed, and we've just been so blessed to see our viewership grow, to see the comments, the feedback grow, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own. It's become quite something.
Yeah. It's fun. And the next time you spoke to my class, as I recall, your daughter helped you carry in like 100 business books into the class and piled them all up and just really encouraged everyone to continue their development. So we are sincere about that. And Dave, I know you are as well. That's why we saw your deliberate intention toward leadership and invited you to join us, and grateful that you said yes to that invitation.
Happy to be here.
Yay. Well, let's go into this book. So there is a handout for everyone. I will have the link posted we can't post in comments while we're on this platform. I will post it in the chat or in the comments of the video later. But right now I will make it a banner so you can grab the handout if you would like to. Let's see, it should be coming. There we go. So it's at voyagecg.com/leadership books. And you'll see at the top of that page, today's book, To Be Honest, Lead with the Power of Truth, Justice, and Purpose by Ron Carucci. And Dave, do you want to tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me get caught up in my All right, thank you. So Ron Carucci is a co-founder and managing partner of Nevalent, which is a Seattle-based leadership and strategic consulting firm. In addition to that, he's done 2 TED Talks. And if you ever want to kind of educate yourself, there's actually a TED Talk on how to do a TED Talk. And it's really kind of interesting to see all the effort that goes into that. So very impressive that he's got 2 of those behind him. In addition to that, has also authored 8 books and then also a regular contributor to the Harvard Business Review, which, as a professor at Rockhurst, I'll say we lean on Harvard Business Review content quite extensively. If you've never looked at any of the content, it's very detail oriented, and it's really a great tool to help develop leaders. So that's a little bit about Ron. This was a great book. Obviously, there's 7 others if you're interested as well. I have not read his other books, but looking forward to doing that as well after this one. It really got me intrigued to see what else he has.
Yeah, his last one looked really good about power. And he started his career in industry as well. So he's been a consultant for a long time, but he was with Pepsi and a power company in New York and ADP. He was a vice president of I want to say organization development or effectiveness, something like that. So he has the chops he understands how industry works, how businesses work, and he's consulting. So I found in my own experience, even being in the room with the C-level folks and the senior leaders making the decisions is different than talking about it outside of that room. So adding that to his repertoire is pretty good. So this book we chose because it bridges the gap from most of ours so far have been about the leader as a person. And this one goes into the leader as a person and bringing those, the character traits, the innate sense of self. This is kind of about who you are as a person and bringing that into your role in leading an organization. And then there's a lot in here about how companies can apply the principles and the tools that he shares. So that was one of the main reasons. And then on a personal note, it aligns very closely with the work I do. He uses the same research studies that I use, and Edelman Trust Barometer. I've posted about that every year when it comes out. That one, Gallup, Harvard Business School, Deloitte, I won't name them all, but very familiar with all of that research. And he also is very much about cultures with a purpose. And I know a lot of people I'm connected to are about being purpose driven personally and in their work as well. So all of this made it a great choice. And when we had our pregame, we all liked the book. So we don't go into a lot of detail before today's conversation. So we're live with each other as well. But in our pregame, we did all, oh, there's my dog, if you heard her. We talked about her right before this. We all did like our dog, like the book. So let's dive in. He does give a little bit of an overview at the beginning. Since it's called To Be Honest, he does talk about what that means, honesty, and he ties it in with truth, justice, and purpose. And when he uses honesty in his book, that's what he's tying it back to. I liked in there that he also talks about honesty as a muscle, and to keep using it, keep practicing it, and look for opportunities for it. So your muscles built up when you need it most in a time of crisis or temptation. And then one of my other favorites in that, and then we'll go into the 4 sections, but he talks about if you're honest during your workday, and even when leadership is hard, and when you get home, that you can look your loved ones in the eyes. And I thought that was a really great tie-in to just who you are as a person. Okay, so ready to go into the 4 sections?
Okay, yep, let's go.
Did you want to chime in on something else before that?
No, we're good. Let's go.
Okay. All right. So the first section is honesty and identity. So Bret, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I wanted to show, and I think I made mention of this last month, if I like a book, there'll be a lot of these little yellow tabs. And for those of you who can see here, there's a lot of yellow tabs. So there's a lot here. So I'm going to jump here to the second chapter, which is in part 1. There was a section there about Marin Alsop. And Marin was a violinist, a very gifted violinist. And obviously the name Marin, she was female. And she was told she could never be a conductor because only men were conductors. And basically when she heard the "you can't," in her mind, that translated to "I must." And that immediately resonated with me. I tabbed that right away. And I thought, I can relate to that. And my real world application of that in a past life, I was with a company, and we really needed the process and the structure and the discipline that a CRM solution would bring to the company, but really didn't have the resources financially to go out and build a commercial solution. And again, it was, you can't. And in my mind, I heard I must. And I was gifted and blessed to be able to be given some resources internally to be able to develop a homegrown, or what we call a native CRM solution, just built out of Microsoft SharePoint workflows. And again, I don't want to give the message to the listeners that, hey, we need to buck authority or go against conventional wisdom. I'm not telling you that. But what I am saying here is, in our example there of Miss Alsop, she demonstrated unconventional grit and determination that when somebody told her she couldn't, she said, I must, or I have to, or I can. And that's how it manifests itself in my career as well. So when I read that, again, there was a yellow tab on that one immediately.
Yeah, that was good. Dave?
It's funny, Bret, you said that. I read that chapter as I was on an airplane flying home on a night flight. So we've probably all been there, right? Where the cabin lights are down and I've got the glow of the iPad as I'm reading the book, and I'm trying to take notes as I'm doing it. And I got to that part, and I got to write this down where you can't equals I must. And, I flip on my light, much to the chagrin of everybody around me, to write this down. And I could quickly feel the temperament in the airplane that I've just ticked off about 10 people. So I very frantically write it down. And as I look back, the handwriting is atrocious. I can barely make it out, but I got to that point. But is what, kind of really got my attention is my daughter plays violin. And as I read this, I went, wow, it's hard to believe that this lady had to overcome all of this. And, one thing I've got my daughter involved in is a music group, for an organization for young women in music, meant to really help young women overcome some of those barriers, just like they face in a lot of other places as well. Music is no exception. So, we were honed in on the same thing as you were saying that. I really picked up on that. I love the narrative that the author added here. It really helped to connect to me personally.
And wasn't that in 2007? I think that in 2007, she became the first female director. A woman became a director. Yeah, 2007. That seems like, really, 2007? Come on now.
Yeah, it took us that long to get there.
Yeah.
I, as a musician myself, I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing female musicians that I would put head and shoulders above of many men that I've worked with. So I kind of did that take back too. It's like, it took us that long. Yeah.
And that specific thing isn't talked about the whole time through the book, but the questioning things like that is the sacred cows or the biases that comes out a little bit later. When in the first section he calls it honesty and identity. I love how he repeats, if you're full of it, people will know. He says it a little differently than that, but so companies will have fancy words on their website or on a placard across the walls, and employees walk by and roll their eyes because the actions are not aligned with the words that are written everywhere. And that he mentions that several times throughout. He does say it. If you're full of it, everyone will know, and your organization will underperform. That's on the bottom of 44. Yeah. So I think that's really important for leaders to please just understand that. Quit chiming in the words, or quit spending days and wordsmithing the mission and values, and then you don't even act on them. In my work, I talk with leaders a lot about being congruent, not just consistent, but congruent. So it's aligned. And I just think that would be so important. And Wells Fargo, of course, he uses that as an example. And what a sad example that was when all of that was happening. And, company had been around 100-something years and they had the best reputation in their industry. And then they just ruined it because they weren't really who they said they were. They were not honest. Yeah. Other thoughts on this part? Nothing else on honesty. What about, at the end of each chapter, I like that he does give some practices with a paragraph or two. And then he does like a summary, of course, and then some practices and so some ways to make it the practical application of it. So I think that's really helpful at the end of each chapter. But one of the ones at the end of this one was encouraging leaders to take misalignment personally. So if somebody behaves in a way that's not aligned with the principles that you identify, to take that personally. And then that goes into the next section was justice and accountability. Bret, what are your thoughts on that one?
I'm looking at my notes here, and I actually have a note from the last section, and it was about, it was this experiment that Carucci noted where they had some chefs and some back of the house workers and some guests, and there were 3 different models in the experiment. The first one, the chefs and the guests couldn't see each other, so they really had no alignment of what the product was, which was the meal, of course. In the second case study, the chefs could see the guests, and then in the third model, that both of them could see each other. And what he was trying to demonstrate was the level of meaningful work, or how fulfilling that work was. And what they found was in the model 3, where the chef and the guests could see one another, the quality of the dish, obviously the level of effort, the level of ownership, increased by 15%. And the result, of course, was that the work was more meaningful because the people working back at the restaurant could see, the people that were going to be impacted by their work. As I was prepping this week, I came across an article which Gene Marks wrote in the Guardian, and it was regarding the Great Resignation. But his quote here says, "Employees want a renewed and revised sense of purpose in their work. They want social and interpersonal connections with their colleagues and managers. They want meaningful, though not necessarily in-person interactions." And again, you see how that ties, that term meaningful work, and then he ties it back, obviously, to the Great Resignation. So how did this manifest itself in my work? By now, everybody that listens knows that I'm in the food production business, and I oftentimes spend time in the plants. And early on in my career, I worked in the plants full time, and that can be kind of a dreary, drudgeful kind of environment. And the company that I worked for, the sales team had secured the contract with the Hard Rock Cafe folks, and they were a very demanding account, great operators, but very demanding of their suppliers. And so what they did, the salespeople brought T-shirts, Hard Rock Cafe T-shirts, which everybody's probably seen, those are pretty famous, and handed those out to the 10 or 15 folks that were going to be involved in making that Hard Rock Cafe product. And in doing so, a simple T-shirt, relatively small investment, made their work meaningful. Again, go back to our example of the Great Resignation and our example of the chefs. By connecting what they were doing on a daily basis through a T-shirt, it made their job more meaningful. And I can stand here today and tell you that we never had a product quality complaint from that point forward. So the call out here is to ask ourselves as leaders, one, is the work that we're asking our team to do meaningful, or even more importantly, how can we make it meaningful? And it's kind of, again, that call to action, that pause, where as leaders, we have to ask ourselves, is what we're doing impacting our employees and our team in the correct way? And do they have an understanding of who their downstream customers are? And is their job meaningful?
And then even how leaders talk to people to bring them that dignity and to include, and that ties in through the whole book. Exactly.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, right on.
Well, and it's always interesting when you read these things, then you kind of have that aha moment to say, hey, that happened to me. And those things are always, it's one thing to read the book and have a good experience and find things that are actionable. But then when you can reflect on things that have actually happened to us as leaders or as people, or even as subordinates or managers, and you say, hey, I did that. I had that. I experienced that. I always think those things are they're very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, and we don't have time to go into all of those, but I was thinking of that in preparation too, like, oh yeah, I had that happen to me, and I had that happen to me, and I had that. Like, this could be therapy.
That's a good way to put it.
Well, should we talk about accountability? Justice and accountability is the second section. Dave, you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, for me, I reflected back without giving away kind of the book, when I reflected back reading this chapter. This kind of took me back to, my first kind of assignment as a manager, and thinking about, unfortunately, the person I took over for had been terminated due to performance. So I was brought in with some pretty clear orders around some things that had to be corrected. And as I started peeling back layers of the onion, I kept finding more and more problems. And as I'm taking notes of this, I'm coming up on my scheduled status meeting with my executive, where I have to share with him all of these things that I found. And I petrified, I go in, and this is where I really connected with that chapter, where I went in and I provided the list, very factual, kept the opinion out of it. And I said, while I know I didn't create these problems, I'm taking ownership for this, and I'm moving forward. And I just paused, and I was waiting for him to get real angry. And he said, "That's great." He said, "You've taken ownership, you're accountable for this. Let's build a plan. Let's move forward, and let's get past it." So it's kind of one of those moments where I went, wow, I guess I kind of unknowingly had the right approach. As I read this section, it really kind of connected those dots for me. So that's kind of what I took away from it.
That's great. Bret?
There was a section here where we talked about performance management, and as we've talked about so often, not every part of the book resonates. And this one, oh my gosh, my radar went up, my blood pressure went up. I just am very, very passionate about performance management. And there's two parts to that. There's the training piece, and then there's the development piece. But part of the quotes that Carucci had here, only 14% of employees surveyed felt their performance was being managed in a way that motivated them. 26% got feedback less than once a year. Only 21% felt their performance metrics were in their control, and 40% of the employees felt that their managers held them accountable for goals that they set. So you can just see how employees are not getting out of the performance management process really what they want or need. And when we talk about the Great Resignation, rather than performance management being an obligation, we should really see it as a tool that we can use in the retention of our key employees. I made a comment here. There's a Dilbert cartoon, which I've used in presentations before, where an employee goes into his managers and he says kind of emphatically, what if we train all our employees and they leave? And the second frame of the cartoon, the manager responds back to the employee, what if we don't and they stay?
Yeah.
And you think about what the impact of that is, and you can just see how misguided management would say, well, we don't want to train our employees. Of course, we're embellishing here a little bit, but as I led this study on development and leadership, what we found is when we look at performance management and we ask ourselves, is that a development topic or is that a training topic? And just to make a distinction between the two, training is typically what the business considers to be those critical skills that are required to do the job. I don't want to think of them as the minimum, but they're the things that, hey, if you can't do these things, it's highly unlikely you can perform the job. Development things, on the other hand, are things where you're preparing for future opportunities or leadership opportunities or advancement or promotion. And generally, development in most cases is left to the individual. There aren't a lot of companies left that have robust training departments that really take on the development of the individual. So here's the takeaway. Here's the question, right? So when we get into performance management, coaching, communication, feedback, giving good goals, setting good KPIs, I would ask, are those critical or are those developmental? And I would argue that they can fall into both topics. But I think what we find, and I've seen this play out time and time again, where businesses aren't doing enough to train their mid-level and frontline supervisors and managers in what they consider to be these soft skills. And my argument, and this is why I got so fired up about performance management in the book, I would argue that those are critical skills that need to be trained. And I would, again, much like we did when we talked about our topic above, challenge the leadership that's listening to the call or on our broadcast today to say, hey, what's your business doing? How are you doing in this area of performance management? Can you do better? What can you do better? What can be improved? And then viewing performance management through the lens of it being a great retention vehicle or retention opportunity versus just simply an annual obligation.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that he talks about that leaders don't do is listen. So they do have performance management systems galore these days. And so the company sets the objectives and they tie up to the company objectives. And then the streams down and the boss will set the objectives for the employee for the year without even asking, what do you want to do? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? How do you want to grow? What are you interested in? And how can we capitalize on your strengths? And they don't even have those conversations. And that's why there's lack of trust. So then it ties in with that first section as well. So people know you're just doing this to check a box and you don't really care about my development. One of the things he says was when it comes to providing constructive, dignifying accountability. We indisputably suck. So we're not, it's the chapter I think is called something with nurturing dignity and accountability. So in my experience, a lot of leaders are afraid of having any kind of tough conversation. What if I give this tough feedback and the person cries? Well, how bad are how are you delivering it? Most of the time, people are not going to cry. So if you're worrying about that, you got some skill development that's necessary.
Absolutely.
But, and then they won't do it. And then once a year talking about performance is not enough. So then all year long, you have a big sign on the wall about caring about your people. They know you don't care. So Dave, other thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I know, if you talk to people that I've managed, they would probably have plenty of complaints about me. But one thing that I'd always told them was nothing will ever come up on your annual performance evaluation that we haven't discussed already. And of all the things I messed up on, that was one thing I held true to every time. And those conversations were always tough, but I did find the more I did it, the better I got at it.
Yeah.
And, they would cry sometimes, but not always. But yeah, it's as a leader, it's, you nailed it with the listening piece of it, but being prepared to give that feedback. And one thing I always, to this day, still do with my leadership, the people above me is walk in and get very animated and point to my feet and say, my toes are pretty tough. Don't worry about stepping on them. Give me all the feedback you need to make me successful, but to also make you and the organization successful.
Yeah.
I've even had leaders come to me and say, do you remember 6 months ago when you told me your feet were tough and I could step on them? Yes, I'm going to do that. Okay, let me have it. And if that's what they needed to kind of use as a crutch to open that door, then by all means, I'm glad it worked and they felt comfortable doing it. So.
I think that's fantastic. I hope people use that going forward. I think that's a great phrase because people don't get feedback. So if you want more, tell them that my toes are tough. You can step all over them. That's fantastic.
Yeah, feedback's powerful. I mean, and you're inviting feedback. So I had a gentleman that worked for me one time, and he said, the answer to any feedback is always thank you.
Yeah.
And there's no good feedback, bad feedback. There's just no such thing. It's feedback is just so valuable.
Yep. Yeah. One other thing I liked in this section was about the Vietnam story that he shared. And I'm not going to regurgitate the whole story here. We don't have a lot of time, but the point of the story was about courage and speaking up when you see things that are going on that aren't aligned with the values or the mission, the vision, the goals that aren't aligned with who you're supposed to be, and speaking up about it, even though it's scary and it can be painful at the time. It can be painful for years, like it was for the pilot in that story, like 15 years, I think it was, that he was vilified for speaking up. And that's very hard to do. But when it's the right thing to do, that you do the right thing.
Yeah.
That's part of the deal. Okay, should we go on to the third section is transparency and governance, not government. We're not going to go, although he does tie in some stories that are relevant to today, but that one starts with about decision making and goes into courage. So Bret, what are your thoughts on this section?
Well, the part that jumped out to me was the discussion about trust. And as I'm reading that, trust is a common theme in so many leadership books. And I immediately went to Patrick Lencioni's The Pyramids, right? And if you've ever worked in an organization that lacked trust, how disjointed and dysfunctional that can be. And so I immediately grabbed that, looked at the pyramid, and obviously the apex of that is results. But that trust theme is so common. And the other part that I looked at was, as we get into stitching with the seams, we heard this about leadership is often about asking the right questions. And Carucci details in here about a case study where he was working with a client and he just developed questions. And the questions were basically for the teams to sit and ask one another. And through that questioning process, they were able to come to some results and really take down some bridges. And we talked a lot about silos as well. So the thing that resonated there, again, I went back to Covey's fifth habit, which is seek first to understand before then to be understood. And again, that theme of trust, and you got Covey's 5 habits, all of these things as we they kind of build on each other. And,
Yeah.
as I continue to read and continue to build my own knowledge, you can see how these things kind of all weave together. So I thought that was great. The last point I had here, and I had to really dig for it. I read it. I couldn't remember where I tabbed it, but as I was preparing, he made a comment in here that 50 to 60% of leaders fail in the first 18 months. And I thought, that can't be. And then I stopped to reflect for a minute, and everybody knows I'm in the food business. There was a CEO of Smithfield, which is a very large pork processing company, and a CEO of Tyson, which everybody knows Tyson. And both CEOs were replaced in 8 months. And you say, well, CEOs never get replaced. Oh, yes, they do. I mean, and those are two very, very, very large companies who appointed, relatively young men as CEOs, and neither of them lasted 8 months. And my call out there is, everybody wants to be in that corner office, but I would tell you, the lights shine very, very bright when you get to that level of the organization. So make sure you're prepared. And hopefully what we're doing in these calls and these conversations are adding to your development and your preparation.
Yeah, right on. And with the 7 habits, he also talks, or the habit number 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood. He makes a point in here somewhere about so many leaders think that they've communicated because they've told what the new thing is going to be. We've redesigned, reorged, and here it is. And I've communicated, but they don't listen. They don't ask questions first. They don't wait 6 seconds for the pause. That's somewhere in here too. The listening, seek first to understand. Such a great point. Thank you, Bret, for tying those together. Dave, what's on your mind with this one?
Yeah, the one that jumped out at me, and Bret mentioned it too. It's asking the right questions. And I go back to when I took a team over and working for an organization that was very heavy in the leadership side. And, we had, as a frontline manager, there was 7 degrees of separation between me and the CEO. So that meant I held team meetings. My boss held bigger meetings. The vice president held meetings. The company wide, we had, global, organizational meetings. And the big complaint of my team, why productivity wasn't where it needed to be, was look how much time we spend in meetings. So I actually deployed a concept from someone named Nicole Steinbach called the 22-minute meeting. And if you've never looked at it, we can post it in the comments. But it's just that the meeting is 22 minutes. It starts on time no matter what. There's a goal-based agenda. You're not allowed to bring devices to the meeting unless you're the taker. The last one to arrive at the meeting has to take the minutes. The thing I love is it has to have a purposed, goal-based agenda, and you have to send any prior reading out 3 days ahead of time. What continues to irritate me in the business world is these standing meetings where we have a weekly huddle, and you either don't get an agenda at all, or if you do, it's minutes before the meeting. It's not very well thought out. And people view that as a waste of time. It's great to have a standing meeting, but if there's not a purpose for that given meeting, cancel it 2-3 days ahead of time. Let your team know. If you're seeking the feedback and input of your team, let them know 2-3 days ahead of time that, hey, this is what I'm looking for. And I'll call myself out. Academics are some of the worst about the last point they make in this is stop the off-topic comments and squash them right away. So, anytime someone stands up in a meeting and says, I realize this is off topic, but no, it stops right there. We'll talk about it later. So yeah, asking the right questions was what really resonated with me and kind of took me back to that 22-minute meeting concept. I'd love more people to follow.
That was a big thing in the, back in the years ago, I'll just say, Sprint, the quality improvement process. There was a big push around the country for that. And Sprint implemented that. And it included a PAL. Every meeting had to have a PAL, a purpose, an agenda, and limits. And so you had topics were timed. I still try to do that and as much as I can, and not accept meetings unless there's a plan, if possible. But yeah, he gives a lot of information on that. Bret, what are your thoughts? Or did you did yours?
Well, I'm just sitting here listening to Dave talking. I just love this because I was in my prep here. I had a meeting this last month, again, and one of the topics of the meeting was how to run a good meeting. I knew that I had been tipped that was one of the talking points. So, I've got this library here behind me, and Patrick Lencioni's, Death by Meeting is up there. And I thought, how am I going to prepare for this conversation? So I grabbed that, and it's a quick read. I read it in 2 days, but you have the stand-up, the tactical, the strategic, and the quarterly offsite. And again, that that framed my conversation and allowed me to, engage in that topic in the meeting effectively. But my point is when you buy a book, right, unless you re-gift it or resell it, it becomes, a resource that you can call on at any time. And amazing that Dave had that as his comments, because it kind of just segued right into what I wanted to talk about.
And this book, I think, is a good one for that too, because he does share a lot of different processes that you can rely on for different teams that you're on, or organizations that you help.
Absolutely.
One of my things I was able to relate to in this section was with Patagonia, with the cotton, changing how they manufactured their fabric, and not just to help it sell more, but it was really about doing the right thing. And it reminded me of the coffee company in Kansas City, the Roastery, and Danny O'Neill, a Rockhurst grad, MBA grad. But that wasn't why he came to mind. It just popped in right then. But he tells a story about his coffee company, and he would go to the South America to look for the beans a year or two in advance. I don't know however much time it is. And the brokers would take him to the different areas, different farming communities. And he really liked the coffee in this one certain area, but wasn't able to get enough. And so rather than just leaving them be, or letting them struggle, and he kept going back to that, and he came up with a plan with the community, and asked questions and learned and listened. And he found out the reason they couldn't get more was because the women couldn't work all day in the fields, because they needed to be home with the children. They had no schools. So Danny O'Neill and the Roastery helped him build a school. So then the kids could learn. It was beneficial to them, beneficial to the community. And he said, as that community grew, because he was buying their beans, then I think others did as well. They had so many more to give or sell. But he said he knew that the community didn't need him as much when he got a request one year for band uniforms. And he thought, okay, they're at the level of band uniforms, they're good to go. So,
right. But it ties back to leaders listening and leaders asking questions, which I think is fantastic.
And then his impact on the community, like, think bigger than yourself, think bigger, think more, think about a bigger purpose. And then the next section goes into more about that. But one last thing on this section of transparency and governance, it's about the decision making inside the organization. And a resource that kept coming to mind was I think it was in the 90s, Edward DeBono wrote a book called The Six Thinking Hats. And a couple of years ago, that book I resonated so many times, but I adjusted the model so it has 8 thinking hats now in the Kelly version, and created a 10-page little document on the decision-making process and how you can use it, capturing all these things that he mentions in this book. And it helps you be objective and overcome biases. And if you need to facilitate it with a group of people, it helps that also. And I would be glad to gift that to anybody that sends me a message. If you see this video, just send me a message on LinkedIn. I'd be glad to send you a PDF of that, the 8 thinking hats. And I think that can help, and that aligns with this. So, and also, before we go on to the last one, unity between groups, I forgot to mention at the beginning that I talked with Ron, the author of this, Ron Carucci, and he has generously offered to send a book to one of our viewers. So, and I don't even know if anybody's watching this live. We don't have comments. So if you are, you could be the first one, but I will wait for, what do you guys think? Like a week? Maybe send me a message and a DM in LinkedIn, and a week from now I'll just put them all in a pot and pick a name out of there, and somebody will get a free book, and it's hardback even, so get a free book from the author. Okay, so we're ready to wrap it up.
Sounds good.
I think we're in good shape.
Okay, the last section is unity between groups. So Bret, do you want to go first this time?
I didn't have a comment specifically on that one. The comment I was going to make here, and I'm just going to tie it back to our previous book, which was Impact Players. I'm on LinkedIn, as we all are, and Adam Grant's got a thing on there that says, if you want to stand out early in your career, this is required reading, and it's a plug for Impact Players. But if you're in this area and you're a heavy reader, Adam Grant is another one of those New York Times best-selling authors, and here he is, giving a resounding recommendation to Liz Wiseman's book.
Yeah, I would agree with that for her book. I added it to my book, my list that's on our website. But yeah, I would agree with that about that. And I'd even go so far to say, if you want to lead an organization, you should read this book.
Yep.
I think in 2022 and going on, he doesn't mention it specifically, but it ties so closely with other research I've seen about employee engagement and loyalty and all of those things. So.
Well, interesting that you say it ties. I had a note here as well, and I've mentioned in a couple of these that, some of the authors reference other authors, and the author that he referenced that stood out was Kim Scott's Radical Candor.
Yeah.
And I ordered it. I don't have it yet, but I'll read it quickly here and give everybody impact as whether or not we want to profile it at some point in the future. But that one's come up at least twice now in several titles that we've read.
Yeah, thanks. Dave, how about you for this last section?
Yeah, so just kind of real quick, with unity between groups, what jumped out at me was, my very first job out of college was working in a tech support organization, a very large tech support organization, where we were all kind of put into silos based on the given piece of software we supported. And the software had over 50 million lines of code to it, so it was highly complex, and each team connected with teams differently. And oftentimes when a help desk ticket would get logged, we didn't necessarily know, was this my issue? I'd start investigating, and then it might need to go to another team. And we were all highly metric driven based on our performance numbers within our given team. So it created this big divide between the teams, where anytime you needed to work with another team on an issue you had, they were not incentivized to work together. And I remember the leadership polled some of us and said, why is this such a problem? And finally we figured out, you get what you measure, and what they measured was the individual performance of the team, not how the teams work together. And I said, you've got to put some type of measurement in place that says, here's how we collaborate and work well as a team. And until you do that, that never is going to happen organically. We can't just make this broad profession of, hey, let's all get along. It's going to happen. They tried. Yeah. It didn't work. So that's what really, hit me when we're talking about unity between groups. At the end of the day, we want the entire business to be successful. That can't be done if each individual group doesn't have the tools that they need to be successful.
Yeah. Was it Microsoft, the example he talked about with Kathleen Hogan, the chief people officer there, shared that they redid their performance management system, and instead of how many widgets did you make or whatever the metric of individual performance, it was how you collaborated and then your contribution, something like that, I think.
Tyler. Yeah. When I read that section, it reminded me of when I was always fascinated by operations management in college. I loved taking those classes that everybody else kind of groaned about. But I remember the professor talking about, the management put a output incentive to the day and the night shift. And they said, whichever production crew puts out more widgets will be rewarded. And for the first several weeks, they saw productivity increase on both sides. And then all of a sudden, the productivity on both ends dropped lower than where they started. And what they found out was the shifts were sabotaging the opposite shift. So the day shift would go out for the day, and they would purposely get equipment to quit or break or do things so that they could produce more. So it's like, okay, we're going about this wrong. So I don't, been 25 years ago, that story still is stuck in my head. And I read the Microsoft example. So.
And he shares so many examples that are similar to that. And he talks about our decisions aren't always that egregious, or our choices are, everyone's not as like the DuPont example, as horrible as them or as benevolent as Patagonia, but somewhere in between there. And so when people are reading this or considering these points that we've made in the conversation, don't think that you're on one extreme. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, and what a great example that is. Yeah. My topics for this one, I think we've brought them up already. The desire to belong, and he has research about that, and people want to belong to something. Stitching the seams, I think Bret brought up, and then bias and othering. Always good to be reminded of that. And he gives tips at the end of each chapter, along with some questions to implement. And he does talk, I think it's in this section, about don't have the flavor of the month tell your supervisors to behave this way, or even on the bias, DE&I and B now, and people have the workshop on it. So that's information, but it's not the same as learning and embedding and changing your culture. So there's more to do in all of that he outlines how to do it in here. And I think that's useful. Anything else on that section?
No.
Anything final points on this book, Bret?
I think it's very good. I didn't know what to expect. I wasn't familiar with the author. And like I said, you can tell by the number of yellow tabs in it that I found a lot of value in it. I don't tab things that are light. If it's tabbed, it's definitely noteworthy. And there were plenty of tabs when I was done.
Yeah. Dave?
Yeah, same thing. I read it digitally, so I can't show you my tabs, but there were many notes. Of all the things, the thing that I just kept going back to was when he talked about, the say-do gap. We've all been there where we get in front of a leader, a poor leader, and, it's all smoke and mirrors. They say we're going to do this. They say we're going to do that. They say they care. And what have you really done for me, for the organization, for the team? And, it's kind of a take on what I tell people all the time. There's words and there's actions, and, what you tell me versus what you get done. And that's the sad truth of it. So it's very simple, say-do gap. And it makes all the connection in the world that I think that leaders that do this, that get up there and say a lot of things and then don't deliver on it, I think they honestly forget some of the things they promise. And people remember that, and it sticks with them. So very impactful to me.
That's a great point too, because he does talk about people don't go into these negative or untoward or shenanigan behaviors with those intentions. It's something else happens, and they slippery slope into that, and sometimes following a leader into that. But such a good reminder there. And that kind of ties in with my last point on the book is at the very, very end, he suggests that you write your own story. So if two people meet somewhere and it turns out they find out that they know you, and one of them says, "Oh, tell me about her," what would you want that person to say? And so think about that story. And in some of the classes I'm teaching this semester, actually, corporate social responsibility. So I'll have them do a 95th birthday. And I have that in my leadership class and in the strategic career management too. Your 95th birthday, and everyone's going to come. It's a big party, and everybody that's known you, they're going to go up to the microphone and say how you've contributed to their lives. What would you want people to say at your 95th birthday party? And then when do you need to be acting that way? Not when you're 94 and a half. So your reputation is consistent behavior over time. Right. And so choose and be deliberate and choose your decisions to support that. Live congruently. And I think he gives the ammunition to do that as a business leader, which is really, really hard. So that's my final on that one. But wow, we could talk about this all day. I had so many other notes to share, but we are way over our intended time that we like to go. But it was such a full book. Last thing is our book for next month. We decided on Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. And our next conversation is April 28th at 4 p.m. And send a message to if you want the 8 thinking hats, and if you would like a copy of the book for today, the author is going to send a copy to someone. So send a message my way, and or a post in the comments, and then connect with all of us on LinkedIn. So connect with Dave and Bret as well as me. And I think that is it. Go to the website for the handout. Let's see, I'll put that banner back up for the end. There's a handout there for today. Actually, there's a website for this book, tobehonest.net, and there's an assessment too. So it's all free. And so that's linked on that handout that you can grab from the website. So I think that wraps it up, doesn't it?
I think so.
Bret,
well, I'm going to share that. I'm going to share that quick quote. I love these quotes. So it was actually in the book. I didn't realize that. I came across it. I was reading a trade pub, and I always bookmark these things, write them down. But it was a Twain quote. And then as I was reading the book, actually, it was in the book as well. So the quote was, the two most important days of your life are the day that you're born and the day that you figure out why. And there's that word why. And I immediately thought of Simon Sinek, right? Know your why. But, Mark Twain was long before Simon Sinek. So that word why and the question that it kind of connotes has been around for a long time. And I'm sure it'll be around for much, much longer. But again, the second most important day is the day you figure out why.
Fantastic. Perfect ending for this. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And we look forward to staying in touch.